Yes. Hello, and welcome to Montreat College's Keystone Scholarship Banquet, Reimagined. My name is David Bruce, Chairman of the Board of Trustees at Montreat College, and on behalf of our President, Dr. Paul Maurer, our faculty, staff, and administration, and especially our students, we welcome you tonight to this very special event. Thank you for joining us. Even though the pandemic has kept us from being together as we normally are in a festive banquet setting, we're grateful for the technology that allows us to bring this very special event directly to you. For the last 5 years, we have celebrated record enrollments at Montreat College. And among those students who populate this valley, where the school is located in Montreat, 98% of them receive financial funding for their college journey through the Keystone Scholarship Fund. That's why tonight is so very strategic and important. And again, thank you for joining us. Tonight, you'll hear from our president, Dr. Paul Maurer, from our students, and a very special address from Dr. Michael Ramsden, president of Ravi Zacharias Ministries International. And he will speak on raising up leaders during an era of disruptive change. But first, an introduction of our president. Dr. Paul Maurer is the 8th president of Montreat College. During his 6 years among us in our valley, he has led this school not only to record enrollment growth, but to a redefinition of our vision and mission statements, the foundation on which the school rests. He's also led the board to adopt a strategic plan for the next 5 years, not only in growth, but in significance, in national reputation, and in every way we would measure the success of a college. The board welcomes his strategic leadership. Dr. Maurer and his wife Joellen make their home among us here in Western North Carolina. They have 4 children. Dr. Maurer is a graduate of the University of Cincinnati, his hometown, Gordon Conwell Seminary, and he received his PhD from Claremont Graduate University of California. We welcome this, our leader, to the moment, Dr. Maurer.
Thank you, David. I thought what I'd do at the top of the evening tonight is to do 2 things. One is to give you an update on Montreat College and then offer some reflections on COVID-19. Back in March, the week of March 9th, when COVID changed the United States and much of the world, Montreat College was on spring break. We decided at the end of that week to give ourselves some time to process what was going on. And so like a lot of other colleges, we extended spring break 1 additional week. During that time, we had to make a decision about whether we would come back or go fully online. And like pretty much all of higher education, we've been fully online for the remainder of the semester. I want you to know that the faculty and the staff have done an absolutely tremendous job adjusting to our new virtual reality, educating, caring, staying in touch, offering regular online devotionals. We know of one student who had COVID-19 and she is fully recovered. I learned last night, tragically, about a dear friend of the college, Norm Van Cott, who died of COVID complications. We're in prayer for his wife, Susan, and their family in these days. Tomorrow is the last day of class, and finals are next week. Like most colleges, we postponed commencement. Some canceled. We decided to hold commencement, which will be held October 3rd. And for those students watching tonight, we really hope you'll come back. In the meantime, we are holding a virtual graduation party on the day and time of commencement, and we hope you'll tune into that. It'll be a fun way to remember Monterey College in your final semester. In terms of tomorrow, I want you to know that we plan to reopen in August for a fully residential fall semester. Athletes begin to arrive on August 8th, and we intend to keep that calendar. We're working with other four-year residential presidents of Western North Carolina to all open together. There's 6 of us here in the western part of the state, 2 publics and 4 privates. We're on calls regularly, and we've developed a 3-pronged strategy for how we are going to attempt to open up in August. Part of it's medical, part of it's political, and part of it's financial. And so MAHEC, the Mountain Area Health Education Center, based here in Western North Carolina, the CEO is Jeff Heck, who happens to be one of our members of our board of trustees. And Jeff and his team are feverishly working out and figuring out how to help the universities open in August, but also how to help the economy open in all of Western North Carolina. I do think that MAHEC, when the story is written about this, will be one of the heroes in that saga. These presidents are working extremely well together and are determined to get back to do what we do so well. Monterey has a vital mission, and we intend to fulfill that mission. It has so much promise, and we intend to fulfill that promise. You're going to hear from Michael Ramsden a little later just how important moral compass leadership is for not just a disruptive time, but for a post-Christian world. And so Christian education has never been more strategic, it's never been more important, and we intend to march on. Now let me turn to a few reflections on COVID-19. Perhaps like you, over these weeks, I've been asking a set of related questions. These questions are, what will be the lasting change of COVID-19? You look at 9/11, there were actually very few permanent lasting changes that came out of 9/11. Airport security changed, our defense as a nation and the Pentagon changed, but there really weren't that many permanent changes. So what will be the lasting changes of COVID-19? What are the lessons of COVID-19? What is God trying to teach us through COVID-19? I reached out to some people that I consider to be wise and mature Christ followers. I asked them that question: if you were to identify one takeaway, one major lesson of COVID-19, what would it be? I thought I'd share a few of their answers and their responses. One was the importance of knowing our neighbors. We should learn our neighbors' names. One was resilience with joy, the lesson that we are able to handle more than we thought we could. Perhaps you've experienced that. Another response had to do with the downtime, and particularly the power of Sabbath. He said, beneath the frantic economic rhythms of our daily lives are much deeper and longer lasting relational rhythms that we need to pay more attention to: the power of Sabbath, the power of rest, the power of those relationships. Another said, the power of prayer is real. This is from someone who got COVID, whose wife got COVID, and whose 2 young daughters also got COVID. They all recovered, but one of their children, aged 5, was hospitalized, and it drove them to pray in a way that they've never prayed before. The power of prayer is real. Another response was, COVID has allowed for the possibility of realignment. This friend wrote, most of us, and by us, I mean college-educated Americans, were on overload, too busy, too distracted, too detached from the things that, upon reflection, we should say that we value: the opportunity for realignment. Another was the utter lack of control that we have, despite the human desire for control and domination. And on a related note, another friend wrote, quote, for a control freak, who has really good plans, it was yet again a reminder that we have minimal control. A pastor friend quoted James 4:13 through 17. Now listen, who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then knows the good they ought to do and does not do it, it is sin for them. That was a particularly interesting comment and quote, in part because it's scripture, in part because it's a little harsh, but I think it makes really valid points about something we ought to think about during this time. So I come back to the questions. What will be the enduring lessons of COVID-19? How will it shape us? How will it shape you? How will it shape you for the better, not for the worse? I don't mean cynicism or fear. I mean, how will it develop our character? How will it develop your character? I encourage you to consider these questions. The old expression, never waste a good crisis, applies to every single one of us in this moment. I pray for each of us that we embrace what God is trying to teach us. And now you're going to hear from Thomas Hill. Thomas graduated from Montreat College in 2017 with a major in cybersecurity. He has since completed his master's degree in cybersecurity and now works for Catawba County government. He teaches an adjunct faculty member in the college's cybersecurity program.
I grew up thinking that I had figured it all out, that the path that I was going to take was what was going to make my father proud. My name is Thomas Hill. I'm from Hickory, North Carolina, and I'm a cybersecurity major at Montreat College. My dad, he was in the National Guard. He traveled a lot, going to different military bases. So he would come home late at night. We would sit there and we would conversate about pretty much anything and everything. And he always inspired me to go and seek my own answers about things, which as a kid growing up, I wanted to be just like my dad. Later, he got sick. He got terminally ill entering into my freshman year at high school. Losing my dad had a huge impact on me. It was definitely a pivotal moment in my life. I graduated and I was kind of figuring out where do I want to apply to college. I was looking at the bigger universities because I knew that the majors that they offered, like cybersecurity and computer engineering, were things that my dad did. I was thinking, I'll do this because this is something that he would want. My dad had this pretty extensive library, and he would put these little yellow stickers on books. So the book that I picked up was The Prince, the Machiavelli. At the very end, on the last page, he had written a note for me. It said, "We are tasked not to go the way of our forefathers, but beyond and anew to our calling." And then I realized that to make him proud, I have to be happy. I have to find my way of being happy in life. I went online and was looking for colleges, small colleges this time, that had cybersecurity because it was what I was passionate about. And I stumbled upon Montreat and came to visit the campus, and I fell in love with it. Because I value a slower relationship with people. Montreat respects that, which is awesome, I think, because they don't expect you to be a certain way. My dad's passing and me choosing a small college like Montreat and having some people here who really care about you that I can talk to has made this much, much easier. Somewhat of a family-like relationship, as I can talk to pretty much any one of them and not feel like, since I haven't been in your class, you don't really know me. It's more of, I know you because you're you, and that's super special to me. So my experience in the cybersecurity program has been one of fascination, getting to really work on the technical side of it, but also developing the person behind the screen. And I think that's really important in this field. You have to have ethics and morals and integrity when you're doing what you're doing here because of how powerful computers have become. Honestly, when I came here, I thought I'd be coding a bit, maybe running some programs, then I'd get my degree and be out the door. But no, I would be working with policies, I'd be communicating with other people within the cybersecurity community and getting to make some real connections that extend beyond the institution or just a piece of paper. Montree gave me the tools, they gave me the inspiration, they gave me the drive to continue on and continue to do what I love. I found my passion, and I know that in doing so, I've made my father proud because I am happy.
As a student, Thomas had an internship with the local county government. During his internship, the county experienced a cybersecurity breach, and Thomas's supervisor asked him to lead the team to help mitigate the breach. As a student, he was called upon to lead in a moment of disruption, and he delivered for his employer. Thomas continues to leave an impression in every area he touches. Just this semester, as a cybersecurity instructor, he learned of a current student whose father is battling stage 4 cancer. When Thomas heard this news, he asked his department chair if he could reach out to the student and offer support as someone who watched his own father battle cancer. Thomas is not unique among Montree College students. His resilience, compassion, and character are commonly found in the residence halls, athletic fields, and classrooms at Montree College. Here, we develop and launch a different type of college student, a different kind of person, one who will impact the world for Jesus Christ in any sphere, and one who is also equipped to lead in a time of disruption. In a few moments, you'll hear from Dr. Michael Ramsden, this evening's keynote speaker. Dr. Ramsden is known worldwide for his passion for interacting with people of all backgrounds and cultures about questions of faith. He currently serves as the president of Ravi Zacharias International Ministry and joint director of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Born in England, Dr. Ramsden grew up in the Middle East and became a Christian at the age of 17 while he was living with his family in Cyprus. He then returned to England to study for a degree in law at the University of Hull, and then for a doctorate in law and economics at the University of Sheffield. In 1997, Dr. Ramsden went to work for Zacharias at RZIM as a passionate evangelist and apologist. He served in this role for 22 years before accepting the office of president at RZIM in 2019. Since joining RZIM, Dr. Ramsden has spoken in over 24 countries and on every continent except for Antarctica. He has preached at the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem on Easter Sunday, spoken in the White House, addressed leaders at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, and given a talk at the UK National Parliamentary Prayer Breakfast, at which 140 members of parliament were present, including the Prime Minister. Michael currently lives in Oxford with his wife Anne and their 3 children, Sarah, Lucy, and James. I trust you will find Dr. Ramsden to be thought-provoking and compelling as he delivers his keynote address entitled Raising Up Leaders During an Era of Disruptive Change.
Hi, my name is Michael Ramsden, and I'd love to thank the college for this opportunity to share a few words with you as we all now gather in disparate places spread right across the world. I'm very much aware of the fact as I record this message that the thing that's preventing us from gathering together, COVID-19, is also extracting a very heavy toll on all of us right across this globe. And with so much still unknown and entering such uncharted waters, I just would like to begin by saying that our thoughts and prayers are with you, with the college and its leadership, and indeed for the leadership of the nation, that you may be given wisdom, strength, discernment, and insight in order to engage fully with the challenges which you all now face. It's a difficult time, I think, to speak about leadership just at any point in the last 10, 15 years or so. And maybe that's even more challenging, so given the circumstances we're in right now. But my hope and prayer is that these few thoughts I'm going to share with you from the scriptures before we jump into a time of Q&A together may be helpful and also bring both some hope and some understanding as exactly what we may be asking God for as we move forward and even as we look to our own leadership. Now, starting many decades ago, all kinds of commentators began to make the observation that we were moving from a society that was talking less and less about its obligations and talking more and more about its rights. Now, of course, there's a difference between the two, and they make us think about things differently. The consequence of all of that is that the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, which both in the UK and in the US, when originally penned, talked about a public happiness that may require private sacrifice in order to achieve it, has now come to be understood in a privatized sense, where it's all about me and my rights and what the government needs to do in order to fulfill my needs and my expectations. Now, that is a huge and daunting challenge for any government then to find itself in, because the consequence of this chain of reasoning, as Bishop Leslie Newbigin pointed out, is that people have begun to look to government in the way they used to look to God. In the past, we believed it was only God who could keep us free from fear and hunger and famine and so on. Whereas we have now, of course, loaded up that weight onto our earthly leaders. And of course, no human government can possibly bear that particular load. The danger then, of course, is that our leadership make promises that they can never keep, trying to deliver something which only God can bring about. And that then leads to broken promise and cynicism. And of course, we've seen cynicism multiply right across the political world in almost every single aspect of our political life. Now, the danger about that, of course, is it leads then to even greater promises, which then just fuels a cycle, and we find ourselves in a situation where it's very difficult to break ourselves out of. Of course, this raises then some very, very important questions. The issue is about what is it that a government may provide and what is it that God may provide, and what does it mean to be a leader in this world, especially when we recognize that there is one who rules also over us. So let me just share a few thoughts with you, which I hope will be helpful and I hope will be also encouraging as well. The first one actually comes out of the book of Exodus. When I was speaking in Ukraine last year, I was able to meet with a variety of political leadership, some of them running for office, some of them already in the highest offices in the land. What amazed me and surprised me was how in every single private conversation I had, we ended up talking about the book of Exodus. The reason being that every leader I met with said, we need a Moses now to come and deliver us. We need someone to come and rescue us and lead us in the way that he led the Jews and led out that people to then become a great nation. On each time and hearing a politician say that to me, I asked them the question, have you been able to read the book of Exodus recently? And of course, many of them hadn't. The interesting thing is that when Moses is leading the people, there is a pivotal point, a critical point, when they come to him and they say, it would be better for us to have been back in Egypt and to die as slaves back there, rather than to die here in the desert with nothing to eat. Now, what's remarkable about their complaint is that by any objective standard, that is wrong. They are not better off trying to make bricks without straw. That's not true. The challenge is they're not comparing what they currently have with what they used to have. They're comparing what they currently have with what they expected to have. And that expectation gap is so big in their hearts and minds, it leads to mass disillusionment. Now, that disillusionment also spills over into the heart of the leader as well, because Moses comes before God and hands in his resignation in the most dramatic terms possible. As a matter of fact, he asks God to take him out of that situation permanently by ending his life. And so Moses then found himself now emotionally unable to cope. And that is one of the huge challenges facing all forms of leadership around the world. How do you cast a vision without falsely inflaming people's expectation? How do we prepare people for the struggle which lies ahead and not just wish for the reward and the goal which we ultimately seek? Now, it's a lesson that all of us are going to have to grapple with and learn and wrestle with one way or another. The challenge has got even greater when you take into account the narrative that so many political and social commentators have given us over the last few decades. 3-4 decades ago or so, we lived in a society where we talked a lot about our obligations and duties as citizens, whereas now we spend a lot of time talking about our rights and demanding them. The consequence, Bishop Leslie Newbigin said, was that phrases like the pursuit of happiness, which hundreds of years ago were understood to refer to a form of shared public happiness that may actually require personal sacrifice and commitment in order to achieve it, We've now moved from that public sense of the pursuit of happiness to a privatized one, where all that ultimately matters is me, and me making sure that I get whatever I feel I want, and therefore I feel that I need. Now, of course, that sets us up for a very, very challenging situation, because that means we begin to look to the government to start to provide what historically we thought only God could do. So we now expect our governments to keep us free from fear and from hunger and from famine and from disease. Of course, that loads every government up with a responsibility and a load they cannot possibly hope to bear, and they certainly can't execute it or deliver it. The result, therefore, is cynicism when we feel consistently that the promises made and given to us have now been broken and we've been let down. The danger, of course, is that our leadership make increasingly fantastical promises in order to try to break through that cynicism, only then feeding into that cycle and actually making the situation worse, not better. What is it that our government can do, and what is it that God can do? All forms of earthly leadership need a form of humility where we recognize what is our place in this world, and we're not trying to usurp the ruler and sovereign of this world. Rather, we realize that we are here to serve him, and when in leadership, we're also then required to serve those who are around us. And of course, it's been pointed out by people far greater than I that the most common refrain that God uses to describe Moses is Moses, my servant, not the phrase Moses, my leader. There's another thing, however, that we also see in that whole story of Exodus and the story of Moses. Moses is actually given the problem twice. The people come to him in the book of Exodus, and then they come back again in the book of Numbers with the same complaint about food. Now, interestingly, the first time Moses hears the complaint, he's able to deal with it very simply. The second time, it causes despair. Now, what is the difference between these two particular instances? Well, the well-known leadership writer Heffetz, writing in 2015, says this. He said, "We live in a time where people are increasingly asking for people to provide simple technical solutions to problems which actually require great personal sacrifice and commitment. And we're looking for someone to come and basically do what it is that we ourselves need to take responsibility for." Now, I think there's an awful lot of wisdom in what he's saying there. He famously authored a book on leadership without easy answers, in which he talks about two different types of leadership required for two different periods of history. He says there's one type of leadership which is required for dealing with technical challenges. Now, these are challenges where the problems are largely known, the resources are largely in place, the cultural norms and the way in which society is organized are well understood. And with good command and control, a leader can bring to bear all of that resource, both the technical expertise and the cultural hearts of the people, and focus them in such a way as to overcome the challenge which is before them. However, there is a different type of problem. And the different type of problem, he says, is what's called adaptive leadership. That is when the cultural norms and the problems are changing and shifting. So now we have a whole series of unknowns. And it's not just a question of applying a technique to overcome a problem. It's about how do you actually lead people's hearts to put them somewhere new. And of course, this is what Moses was wrestling with when he heard the complaint the second time. When he was given a technical problem to overcome, we need food, in the book of Exodus, he's easily able to respond. But in the book of Numbers, when the people come and say, "What have you done? Where have you brought us?" Moses now feels despair because he realizes now the problem isn't the food, the problem is the people. And the question is, who or what can change the heart of the people? And now he realizes that there is a limit to his own form of leadership, and actually it leads to a form of despair. Now, of course, the wonderful and incredible thing is that we worship and serve a God who specializes in the transformation and changing of the human heart, which is why we also now need leadership who are willing to lean and rely on God and on his grace and his spirit to see him at work in other people's lives and hearts, and to ask him to make us his vessels for his service, so that we can then deliver something which is that we could not bring about through our own strength, but with God and in Christ, we can actually see come about. Of course, there's another challenge as well, and with this, I will leave and largely sum up. Several years ago, I was asked to speak in London, in Westminster, at a memorial service being held for C.S. Lewis, being attended by all kinds of people, and it was a huge honor and privilege to be a part of this two-day event. I'll never forget after it, a retired military leader in the UK, one of the most a senior general, asked if I would come to his club as he would like to ask me some questions. And as we sat down over lunch, he poured out questions for several hours, and after I'd done my best to try to answer as many of them as I could, I said, may I ask you one? I said, when I was growing up at the age of 15, I thought I knew what I wanted to do. Now, God ultimately changed that. I thought at that point I wanted to be a lawyer and go and practice corporate law. I said, but I felt I was committed to something and I wanted to achieve it. And I was very much focused on trying to get there, which is why I, of course, embarked off on a law degree. I said, now forget about being 15 or even 25. I meet people who are 35 and they seem to be drifting through life, not focused on anything, unsure of what they can do or bring about, trying something for a few years and then moving on to something else. I said, my question to you is this: how do you breed leadership in the absence of commitment? He sat back in his chair, folded his arms, and he said, that's a very good question. He said, Michael, you may not know this. For the last few years of my operational life, I was in charge of officer selection, recruitment, and training for the armed services. And this was one of our greatest challenges, trying to find people who were actually sufficiently committed so that we could actually form them into leaders. Well, a few hours after that, I was waiting for my family in the center of London. They were coming down for me because I was speaking the next day in a church and we were all going to stay overnight in a hotel. So we were going to leave our home of Oxford and just overnight there to save a bit of the wear and tear on the body going backwards and forwards between the two events. And as I was waiting for my family, I was in a shop buying something and I got chatting to the gentleman next to me who was actually from America. And as I heard his accent, I said, I think I know where you're from. Where in the States do you hail from? He said, well, I'm from LA. And I said, what are you doing here? He said, well, my wife is currently watching a play. I'm not particularly interested in the theater. I'm waiting for the show to finish. Then we're going to go out for dinner. And I smiled and I said, well, actually, I'm also waiting for my family. They're coming down en route from Oxford. I'm buying a few things for us to have where we're staying just overnight. And we'll be going out for dinner tonight. And then I said, may I ask what you do? And he said, well, he said, I'm retired now, but I used to help run the LAPD. And I smiled and looked at him and I said, well, I know exactly what your job entails because I've seen all the movies. Now, he laughed at that remark and we sat down. It began a conversation. About half an hour into the conversation, I said, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I just told him the story about the general who I'd just been having lunch with and the question I asked him. And I said, may I ask you the same question? How do you breed leadership in the absence of commitment? Well, again, he sat back in his chair, looked at me and he says, you know, for many years, that was part of my portfolio that I was responsible for. How do we train officers? And how do we find them? He says, you'll have no idea how difficult that is. We've brought in all kinds of motivational speakers, experts, all kinds of people to advise us, but it feels like a problem that we've been unable to overcome. It is impossible also to breed leadership in this world without a strong moral compass. When we talk about commitment, we need to know what we should be committed to and the process by which we actually make that commitment for something. And that's an inherent moral decision. And right now we need a form of moral conviction within our leadership as well. Because without that, and without that form of commitment, it means that we cannot stick by the unpopular decisions when we need to. We'll always be swayed by, as we pursue a public opinion. And of course, as someone very astutely said, the best way to become unpopular as a politician is to seek popularity. So now we find ourselves in that time, and that is one of the reasons why I'm so thankful for God for an institution such as yours. Because we need to give people a broad-based education, but we also need to be committed to helping raise up a whole new generation of leadership. People who understand what they can do and only learn what God can do and call on him in times of trouble. We need to have that humility. Moses was described in scripture as the most humble man that had ever lived. We need people who also understand the difference between simply overcoming a problem and then how to provide leadership to people's hearts when all of our cultural norms and values are being challenged and overturned. And also at the same time, we're looking for people who understand and have that clear moral compass at the center of their life, so that by the Spirit of God and the application of his Spirit to our conscience, we can be led and guided in times of great difficulty and distress. Well, I hope these things and remarks have been helpful for you, and I very much look forward to going into a time of Q&A with you now.
I'm quiet in cloudy waiting, assured of little but weaknesses, of faith and seeing. And I'm wanting only to be filled in this day. And I know you're coming soon, but would you show me where you are right now? in cloudy waiting. I'm craving the clouds of your returning, assured of little but a strength beyond faith and seeing. And I'm wanting only to be filled. I'm wanting only to be still in this day. And I know you're coming soon, but would you show me where you are right now? In cloudy waiting.
Hopeful for the fruit of faithfulness. Oh, but they are slow when they're going, and quick to accuse me every silence comes.
I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to all of the donors who allowed my life-changing time at Montreat a possibility. Your generosity is multiplied. Thank you.
I'm now live with Michael Ramsden, the president of RZIM. This is really a great opportunity for us and for you to hear from Michael. It is 12:40, almost 12:40 a.m. in Oxford, England, where Michael is. Michael, are you awake in there? First, I just want to say thank you for your ministry through RZIM. I want to thank you for your comments this evening about leadership in an era of disruption. And I also want to thank you for being a good sport to do a Q&A at 12:30 your time. You actually look pretty good for 12:30. Thank you so much.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be with you and help serve in any way I can.
In your comments tonight, you described leadership, and it really described a certain kind of leadership. You outlined a particular kind of leader. If I understood you correctly, the leader you're describing has one or more of the following traits. Number one, low expectations of others, especially the government, to deliver the conditions of happiness. Two, you described, I think, someone who has an orientation toward the broader concept of the good or the common good, and a sense of duty and obligation as over against personal ambition or gain. 3, you described someone who keeps his or her promises. You talked about commitment. I wasn't sure exactly what you meant by commitment, but maybe it was to the mission of the organization they work for. You also described someone with a moral compass. Did I get close to summarizing kind of this view of leadership? What did I miss, or what would you add?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good summary. And as you said,
Leaders, but it's also the cynicism that comes with unrealistic expectations on any human being, including a Moses-type leader.
yeah, no, that's, and I think what we're urged to understand is we can have a complete reliance on God, but we see all earthly leadership fail, and that's recorded very well for us in Scripture. Scripture doesn't polish over that kind of stuff at all. It deals with failure very directly. And we see two things, and it raises this very interesting question. If God is able to do everything, why involve us at all? And it's a huge privilege that he does. So Genesis, the book of Genesis starts with God creating a universe. The book of Exodus finishes with him asking us to build a temple. Now, he can build his own temple if he wanted to, but he has delegated back in authority. So even when we're commanded to do something, we have to assume that responsibility and then figure out, okay, how do we carry it out? And the good news is it's not just in our strength, we can rely on him. But there's a danger as the society becomes increasingly secularized that we begin to fool ourselves. We bring everything about by only by the work of our own hands. And that's always going to lead to a disappointment.
So are those qualities that I just listed as a potential summary of the leader, is this the Moses that everyone wants?
Well, I think sometimes the trouble is we actually get the leaders we deserve. And so I think there's this very key thing when we're dealing with so many unknown factors. The temptation can be, we think a Moses is going to come and tell us everything that we need to do. Whereas actually what we need is someone who can lead us through enormous change. And as we said in the talk, even Moses himself realizes that there's also some form of change when it comes to change of heart and changing people's lives that actually he himself is totally ill-equipped to do. That's going to have to come from a different source. And so I think what's important for us is to teach about leadership well, so people are looking for the right kind of thing. Otherwise, we've seen throughout history all kinds of fascists and dictators rise to power by the promise of a utopia. You look at communist Europe, for example, promising to deliver something which sounds absolutely fantastic, but actually in reality becomes totally oppressive. And that's a very dangerous situation to find ourselves in. And we forget our own history. We sometimes forget that when we look for the wrong type of leader, we will get the leader we were looking for, but the consequence in our society is huge, and it can last for generations. And I think we've become a bit complacent in the West because we haven't had to live through what's happened when we have that kind of leadership over us. But the further we move from the gospel and the values it imparts, the more danger we are in actually realizing that.
So, Michael, we had a bit of a technical glitch, as I've learned. When I asked you that first question, they heard the question, but they didn't hear your answer. And the question was, did I get close to describing the kind of leader that you were trying to paint the picture of? And did I miss anything, or what would you add? They did not hear the answer to that question. Might you just repeat that?
Yes, of course. No, very happy to. Yeah, I think the key point that's coming out there is that we can't rely on any earthly authority to do things, for everything for us, even when that authority is reliable or trustworthy. So there's an important factor in which we actually have to learn what it means to actually throw ourselves in. So we're not expecting to be spoon-fed all the way through. And I think, the list we talked through in the talk wasn't meant to be comprehensive, because there's an important part about being able to cast vision. And actually, there's a very interesting thing about visionary leadership too, which is Moses, when he died, was described as someone with undimmed eyes. And the question is, when it says he had youth and undimmed vision, how did those two things interact? And actually, I think maybe one caused the other. The fact that he never lost the vision that he had to be able to serve meant that he was able to actually maintain that sort of youthfulness before the Lord as well. So there are other things that need to go into that list, but in a very disruptive time where everything's changing, and we're actually now looking to see transformation of people's hearts, we need to be looking for a different type of leadership.
It's actually a great segue to my next question, and that is, Jim Collins, in his very famous book, Good to Great, describes the top level of corporate leaders. This is really written from a secular standpoint, this level 5 leaders, as possessing what very, very few leaders have, and it puts them at the very top of the leadership pecking order in his research, and that's the quality of humility. And so I'm curious what the role of humility, what role that plays in your view of the Moses type leader and the necessary type leader, and do you see that as a core trait?
Yes, and I think what is interesting, again, when you look at it biblically, the greatest leaders were remarkable in their humility, and obviously Moses himself being described as the most humble man, who had lived. And I think that's because a leader needs to be able to recognize talent and release it in other people. And if you're so self-confident, you can think you can do everything yourself, and you don't have the humility also to recognize your own weaknesses and where you need help, you're going to get into trouble. And Moses learned that too when his father-in-law challenged him and said, "The way you're leading is not good." And he has that challenge where he's trying to assume too much to himself, and he has to learn then to delegate and raise up a whole bunch of leadership underneath them. And I think that's why a leader with humility can be very, very effective, because they have an army of reliable leadership underneath them. When we rule by fear, we don't know who we can trust, and we can't build relationship. But when you have it's not a lack of belief in the fact that something can be done. It's just a lack of feeling totally self-assured and very puffed up. And I think what we see time and time again in Scripture is Moses seemed such an unlikely leader. He was scared to speak when he first started. David was so insignificant as a figure that when the prophet came asking to see the sons, he wasn't even considered to be brought into the room. He was so low. And so very often we've seen that some of the greatest leadership that's had the greatest, longest lasting impact in the world has actually come not from those who have that sense of humility before the Lord and develop that sense of the right dependency on God, but even in the secular setting, as you're saying, I think the reason it's so effective is it creates all this space for other people to be able to come up and for them to do what they can do.
Let's explore the role of the environment in which leaders are developed, and these sorts of leaders are developed in particular. Do you agree that leadership is a combination of nature and nurture, but that a person's environment is absolutely critical to developing great leadership?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and I think it's also why really good education is very important too. We all have a different set of skill set, and different leaders can actually look and operate very, very, very differently. And you see in the life of anyone who is an effective leader that they go through this forming pattern. So the environment they find themselves is very, very important. And also the kind of instruction that they're taking on board becomes very important. And when leaders particularly are unable to be continual learners, then that lack of continual learning means that their leadership lacks depth. And it also begins to lack adaptability as well. So I think that nurturing environment is critical. And that's why you'll see even very established leaders will continue to look, for mentor figures in their lives and be asking the questions, where can I learn and receive additional input that's going to continue to sharpen and improve me as I seek to serve through leadership. So I think that ongoing environment is really critical, and to make sure the right kinds of things are taught. You talked a little bit about commitment earlier. And by that, what I meant was, if we're unable to be committed to anything when the situation is difficult, the temptation could be to run away from it. And we have to figure out, so commitment is a moral process by which we're figuring out what it's worth being committed to, and how we actually discern whether it's worth being committed to it. So I don't know what happened in the States, but I know, a few years ago, we had a huge problem with various people going off to go and join ISIS and fight for them. Now, I think that's a disastrous thing, but it also demonstrates a lack of moral leadership in our culture in parts of the West. People looked at this group and thought, here's something that they stand for something. They believe in something. They're prepared to do it and put their lives on the line. They romanticized it and they joined it. Now, as I said, I think it's disastrous, but in the absence of a clear, compelling call for committed leadership that's actually demanding, we will lose those kinds of people to that thing. So if we can't instill that moral reasoning into people, we'll end up being committed to the wrong things for the wrong reasons.
Let's talk about the role of Christ-centered higher education. There are any number of laboratories that serve as environments to develop these sorts of leaders. In what way do you see Christ-centered colleges like Montreat College playing a strategic role in developing these key leaders for tomorrow?
I think it's an absolutely mission-critical thing. At one level, you could say that there is a growing leadership gap in our world. Where are the people who are prepared to make a stand for what is right, who are prepared not to go with the flow, who learn to question and challenge well? It's very, very interesting when you look at all the key leaders in the Old Testament, for example, Abraham, Moses, you name it, Job. They all question and challenge God. And it's interesting, if you think of God as, as a leader, why does he allow that kind of questioning? And the answer is, if they can't learn to question him well, they won't be able to question the other earthly authorities they find themselves interacting with well either. And so I think being in a Christian college context where you're learning both about the character and nature of God, the character he's looking for in us, but then also the skills and the processes by which we learn to process appropriately and challenge appropriately and think things through, is actually really, really, really important. And God doesn't need Abraham giving him advice or asking questions. That's not what's going on in that particular dynamic. It's actually just as important for Abraham as he's growing into stature of the person that God wants him to be, that that process is allowed to happen. And I'm sure you can look at your life, and I know I can look at mine, at older, wiser Christian leaders over our lives when we were younger, who took our questions really well. We may look back on them now and wince a little bit and think, crumbs, that wasn't a good question, but they were gracious enough to take the question and use it as an opportunity to actually see us grow. And I think there's a very precious trust, therefore, and I think potentially a huge influence that graduates out of colleges such as Montreat can have, if they can learn these lessons well in an institution such as this, then it puts them in a very, very good place to go out to influence the world.
What advice do you have for students or young professionals who see themselves as future leaders?
Well, I think someone very famously said, if service is beneath you, then leadership will be beyond you. And I think it's important to learn to serve well. One, it's not just about the right kind of character, but you'll also discover, if you do come into a position of leadership, how much you'll appreciate those who are also able to figure out how they can serve. So I think the easiest place to start is learn to take responsibility. Don't pass the buck. Figure out when you can step in. There's a beautiful saying, when when the people were still in Egypt, it says in the scripture, he looked around and he saw there was no one. That's when the guy was being beaten and he stepped in. Well, the context of that is a building site. So it couldn't have been that there was no one in the building site. That's highly unlikely. As a matter of fact, we learn a little bit later, there were people there and they saw what happened. But that phrase, and he saw there was no one, has been understood by a lot of scholars to mean he saw there was no one willing to step in, no one willing to say something to this guard who's now beating this guy. And so he steps in. So learn to take responsibility, learn to learn well, learn to own your mistakes in a constructive way. And maybe you'll discover that mistakes are the most expensive things that will happen to you. So if you can learn from other people's mistakes, so they pay the price, you can learn the lesson, then I'll take that free education. And it will begin to provide a bedrock within which you can really grow.
That's great counsel, Michael. We're coming to an end of our Q&A time here, and I just want to give you a final opportunity to say anything that you want to say to wrap up our time.
Well, certainly to all of you who are watching online, I want to thank you for your commitment. I think this is a time when, as Christians, rather than shrinking back, we need to find a way also to step up. Our experience has been that the online audiences we've been addressing are 5 to 10 times larger than many of the physical ones we would have done. We're finding an awful lot of churches are saying they have a lot of non-Christians come into their online services. And we're seeing viewing figures for some of the things we're doing up in the millions right now. So there is an opportunity amongst this crisis where people are now asking questions about their lives, about purpose, meaning, identity in a way it's never before. So as we continue to pray and we continue to ask the Lord for deliverance, let's also ask him what he would have us do. How can we continue in our support of the church and of organizations like Montreat? How can we continue to serve in our local communities? How can we continue to speak up? And maybe just one closing thought. I was reading recently this illustration of this idea that letters carry meaning. They're individual signifiers that are capable of carrying meaning, but a letter by itself doesn't do very much. But when you start to string them together, you get words, then you get sentences, paragraphs, and perhaps even novels. And by all standing aside together, standing aside alongside each other during this time as a church, maybe this is an opportunity to send a really strong message of what the gospel of Jesus Christ looks like and the difference it makes, and especially with all the uncertainty that we currently face.
Amen. Michael, thank you so much for taking time to give us a bit of your wisdom and insight with your address, and for being such a good sport and doing the Q&A. Thank you. It's been a real gift to me and a real gift to the college and to those watching. God bless you as you continue your ministry.
Thank you. Bless you as well.
For those of you that keep your calendars and plan ahead of time, I want to give you the date for next year's KSD. We plan to be face-to-face back at the Biltmore. We'll probably live stream it. It's April 29th, 2021. I also want to announce the fundraising total for tonight. As you know, this is our Keystone Scholarship fundraising dinner. It's become the signature event of the year for the college. Last year, the college's goal was to receive $400,000 in gifts from you, and you gave $408,000. We beat the goal last year. This year, the goal was raised to $425,000, and as of this afternoon, you had already given $454,000. You crushed it. Thank you so much for your generous giving to our students and their scholarships. And today we decided to increase the goal from $425,000 to $500,000. And we are asking that you might consider helping us get there. If you've been inspired by what you've experienced this evening, if you're inspired by the mission and vision and trajectory of Montreat College, if you want to support our students financially, I encourage you to scroll down on your computer screen where you have the opportunity to make a gift. Thank you for your support of our very, very fine students, the leaders that God is raising up for tomorrow. Thank you for joining us tonight. I hope it's been inspiring, informative, and thought-provoking. Christ-centered higher education has never been more important. I'm grateful for your partnership. God bless you, and good night.